Hello and welcome to week 10, Introduction to Psychology. I hope you had a good break. I did make a little bit of a change this week. I took chapter 10 and I put it into next week. So all we're going to be looking at right now is chapter 9. It is going to be on lifespan development. This is a huge topic. We have a whole class on it called Developmental Psych, PSY 215, where we go into a lot more detail. But here we go, kind of take a whole class and put it into just one chapter. So wish me luck on that. So here we are, chapter 9, lifespan development. And right off the bat, what I want to talk about is aging. This is an intro to psych class. It's teaching you about thinking. It's teaching you about personality, thought processes, emotions, motivation, all of that stuff. What developmental psych does takes all of those things and looks how do they change over time. So we ask a question. I have this arrow pointing at this young girl. Where is her memory? Where is her thinking patterns? Where is her personality? Where is her cognitive processes? How is she doing in terms of processing her emotions? How are her social relationships? All of those things. We can look at that age and take a snapshot of that. We can look at an older girl. Maybe she's pre-middle school. You have this young lady. What's going on in her life at that particular time? What's going on in this guy's at this particular time? And what's going on with this lady at this particular time? And what this provides us with is a perspective. As we look at all those things we learn in psychology and we say, well, how do they manifest themselves at a particular point in time? Because just if we think about something as simple as memory, not that it's that simple, but think about memory, what was your memory processing like when you were 3 compared to what it is today? And it's definitively, qualitatively, and quantitatively different. And the theories that we build within lifespan development or developmental psychology explain how those particular characteristics change over time. So what we get is a process of looking at normal development. We focus on normal development, meaning what are the typical ways in which people develop over time and sociocultural patterns and whatnot. And then when we are armed with all of those theories, we're able to take what I call the developmental perspective, or the DP. Now the DP, what it does, what our concern is, the application of developmental psych is like this. Let's just say that you are a nurse and you are working on a med-surg floor, various age people that are there, and you're given a new patient, and that patient is a newly diagnosed diabetic, insulin dependent, and you need to go in and teach that individual how to manage their diabetes. So you have to build a strategy. How am I going to teach this to this person? And one of the questions that you might ask, almost intuitively, is, well, how old is the person? And I'm going to point that out. I'm going to pull that right out of your dialogue, and I'm going to say, why are you asking how old? You need to know how old the person is because you need to know what context that person is in. Where are they living? Do they have parents with them? Are they living alone? Do they have young children? Are they working? Are they not working? All of that stuff, because you'll have to bring that into your training. At the same time, you're going to think, well, how do they understand the world? How will they understand instructions? Should I use a teddy bear to exemplify giving shots? Or do I just need to demonstrate to the person depending on their age? And so that is ultimately the question. How do we teach somebody about their new diabetes? We ask a question. How old are they? If they're 3, that's different than when they're 7, and it's different than when they're 12 or 28. Or 52 or 96. We change our methods based on how old they are because we intuitively know that their thinking, memory, process, their emotions, all of that are different qualitatively and quantitatively across the lifespan. So that is taking the developmental perspective when we take age into consideration. Now, there are forces of change that we recognize within human development, and we kind of categorize them in terms of clocks. And you can see the background of my image here, and we call these the developmental clocks. Now, clocks mark time. That's certain things that happen. At noon, it's lunch. At 12:30, it's snack time. That's how my clock works. But by 5 o'clock, maybe it's dinner. And you start getting sleepy right around 8:39, and you force yourself to stay up until midnight to get your psychology work done. All those things, time marks when things happen. So as a focus in psychology about when things happen as we grow older, we have developmental clocks, what's going on at a particular age in development. Now, these are divided into 4 different kinds. I'm going to quickly go through these, good explanation of these inside of the course book. So the first clock you're probably familiar with is the biological clock. And this clock marks time based on our genome, based on when are we going to age, when are we going to be in puberty, when are we no longer going to have kids, when are we going to get our first gray hair. It does not have anything to do with kids. It's a genetic timetable of maturation, of physical maturation, when those things are going to happen. Set in biology, those things are happening almost regardless of the environment. Of course, extreme environments like starvation and war will all obviously throw those things off, but the biological clock is pretty much set. We are going to live and pass through these biological transitions in this time frame. Now, the next one, closely related to the biological clock, one you might not be familiar with, is the psychological clock. And this has to do with psychological maturation. This is the maturation of all the things I was just saying in terms of cognitive abilities, memory, learning, emotional regulation, personality, interacting with other people, those kinds of things that develop over time. So we might say that sometimes our biological clock and our psychological clock are right in tune with each other, and sometimes they're not. So, for example, young girls become capable of bearing children at these days, 11, 12 years old. So biologically, they're ready to be moms, but are they psychologically ready? Now, I'm not going to say no yet. There might be some that are psychologically ready. They're advanced psychologically, just like in their psychological clock is directly in tune with their biological clock. But our society has a sort of, we don't really think 11, 12, 13-year-olds are ready to be having children. And for the most part, emotionally and cognitively, they're not. So you can see these things are not necessarily aligned with each other. So that really ushers in the third clock, which I find one of the most fascinating to talk about, and that is the social clock. Now, the social clock has to do with at what age does society think certain things should be happening? And this starts right off the get-go. When is a kid supposed to know their alphabet? When are they supposed to start reading? When are they supposed to be able to understand when we tell them to do something? When are they going to go to school? When are they potty trained? These are things we sort of obsess about, even though many of those things are closely tied to biological and psychological clock time cycles. They're going to happen when they're going to happen, and no time sooner. But society has a view. It has when should certain things happen. Now, we see that manifest mostly in early childhood. We see it through the manifestation of grades, at first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. Not completely arbitrary, but somewhat arbitrary. Kids are not. They don't turn a magic age and suddenly they're ready for fourth grade. They're developing their psychological clock and their biological clocks, and they pretty much line with those things, but there's always outliers where people are either advanced or behind what society says they should know and be able to do during certain grades. Now then we start getting into adulthood. That's when things kind of get really funky. And in my psych class, in my developmental psych class, and in my class on adulthood, I have a whole class just on adulthood, we examine that transition into adulthood and what that's supposed to look like, and very importantly, when is it supposed to happen? When do you become an adult? And actually, the whole field of developmental psych is really grappling with that transition process, particularly in the West, here in the United States and Western countries, is being very protracted. That gradual entry into full adulthood, however we want to define that. So we have these concepts like, say, like failure to launch. At 35 years old, what should you be doing? Just go through your head right now. At 35 years old, what should a 35-year-old be doing? What should a 55-year-old be doing? What about an 80-year-old? What should they be doing? And we know that there's anomalies, but we all have this sort of inner perspective of, well, by 35, I probably should be in, kind of the job I want to do. My family's going along. I have kids in school. I have friends. Got some things happening. Really have things going on in life. At 55, maybe I've moved up to being a supervisor at my work. I'm planning for retirement. My kids are now maybe grown. These kinds of things, these expectations that we have that are all defined by society, and they make up what we call the internalization of our social clock. Now, the last one is a fun one, and that is the historical clock. Now, the historical clock has to do with when you were born, the year that you were born, and what you experienced in terms of the world and society and what's going on and how it shaped who you are today. Now, when I was born in 1965, it was a very different world than people who were born in 1980. And even though I've experienced all those things from 1980 on, just like the person who was born in 1980, I experienced them at different points in my life. So they had a different impact on me. And so as we grow up, I have memories that precede the memories of individuals who were born in 1980, and I have a perception of things that were very early 80s, let's say when I was graduating from high school, and kids were being born in 1980, certainly different perspectives of that. But how did they affect me? How did it affect who I am that I was born in a particular year and certain social conditions were in place? And that's when we introduce what we call the generations. This is a way in which we categorize those individuals born in certain times in history, and you've often heard of them as traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen 220 or Gen Y or Gen Z. There's all kinds. They're going to run out of alphabet here soon, so they're going to be, we're going to have to figure that out. But nonetheless, we have names for groups of individuals and their particular characteristics. So let's go back to the slide here and talk about these a little bit. Here's millennials born between 1977 and 1997. They were aware of the 9/11 attacks. Community service is a big part of them. Immediacy, having that sense of things coming to you very quickly, largely technologically based. Confident, lots of diversity. Social, everything. Everything is a social process here. This is the generation that made Google and Facebook what they are today. Now, right before that, however, is my generation. This is me. I'm Gen X. I was born in 1965. I'm right on the cusp of baby boomers and Gen X. So there's a little bit of boomer in me and a whole lot of Gen X. We saw the Berlin Wall fall, the Gulf War, very independent in terms of our perspective. We're free agents. Grew up with the advent of MTV, the internet, and of course the AIDS scare in the 80s. And mobile phones. So how did these things change my life? How did they make me different, let's say, than millennials? Now, it's important to recognize, however, that these are not holes into which people, you were born in 1997, this is the way you think. No, these are general categories, big data, and in all actuality, for the sake of this particular class, I'm just asking you to look at them. Look at your parents, where they are, and see if they're somewhat accurate. Or maybe you should have been born in another generation because your values and whatnot align more with that one. Whichever. Take a look at where you fit in those particular generations and reflect on how they do or do not describe you and the people around you. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this class is, of course, Erik Erikson, a very famous psychologist who was a student of Sigmund Freud. He actually coined the term psychosocial to represent his theory of human development as an interaction between the growing psyche and the social expectations. So essentially, he's kind of talking about the psychological clock and the social clock, kind of psychosocial. That's how that word kind of like comes together. And he developed a very famous stage theory that I have a lot of affinity for. I think it describes human development very well. It's not necessarily a linear. You don't go right through and you can't go back. Sometimes you go back and start over. And sometimes when you're doing something new, you start over. Like, you can actually describe the pattern of a relationship, a new relationship, using those same stages, just as a thought experiment. But of course, Erickson was talking about general human development, the stages that people would go through. So let's take a look at his theory, represented by this graphic. So here we have 8 stages starting on the top left: infancy, then into early childhood, preschool, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and then finally maturity. So if we took a look at each one of these, look at infancy, the basic premise here, and Erickson describes these as dichotomies, like one result of this stage is a positive outcome of the relationship between the developing psyche and the social expectation. On the other end of that continuum is the sort of negative outcome, and that's a continuum. It's not either or. So what's going on during infancy? The child is developing a sense as to whether or not they can trust the world to take care of them, and that they're welcomed in the world. The next one, what we would call the terrible twos. Kids are doing things on their own. Are they going to be allowed to do that, or are they going to be developing a sense of shame and doubt? Then they go into preschool, the really horrible threes, as we might talk them. These are the kids that will take initiative, like, I'm going to cook my dad and mom breakfast this morning, and, the smoke wakes you up. So it's this initiation of ideas. So just look at these first 3. We have, do I trust the world and it's going to take care of me? If that's good, then I'm going to take the chance on autonomy. And if that's good, I can do things for my own, then these inner ideas that I get to imitate what I see around me, that's going to be supported. So positive development pushes positive development. It makes more likely for positive things to happen in the future. The same with negative. If I mistrust the world, I've been abused and neglected as a child, I might not be as autonomous. Without the autonomy, not taking as much initiative. You can see how once you set on those negative tracks, it's a little harder to get back onto the positive tracks. So then we go into schools, and here for the first time we're looking at how kids are compared. What am I good at? What am I not good at? What am I superior at, inferior? And we really get this kind of coming together of the social world where we're evaluating ourselves, not objectively just looking at ourselves. We're evaluating ourselves in comparison to others and how they are. So it's a very important stage, this particular industry versus inferiority. As we move into adolescence, we have kind of a coalescing together of the first 4 stages coming into develop. Basically, I like to think about it as the foundation for identity. What the individuals start to have an idea of who they are in the world, things that they can do on their own, initiatives that they can take, and what they're good at and not good at. And they're ready to start really constructing their identity. And identity becomes part of the theory from this point on, building that identity much the way we would build a house. Now, it's also the time at which we turn to these young people and we say, what do you want to do in your future? Because the psychological clock has now developed. They can start actively really thinking about that and planning for that. So society's expectations for thinking about the future and what you're going to do and where you're going to go and all those things, which are very important and part of identity, actually start to happen right in Erickson's stage where identity is a focus. Then something peculiar happens. Right now, we are, as I told you before, we have a new stage maybe that's coming out called emerging adulthood, which is a transition from childhood adolescence into young adulthood. And this can take up the whole 20s. And what it is it's gradually but not fully taking on the aspects of adulthood. So they might have moved out on their own, but mom is still paying for their cell phone. They might be in college or education, so they're living in the dorm for a while, then they're renting. There's a tendency to move around a lot. Relationships are sort of the mechanism by which they are living. Those are also very fluid. Their ideas about what they want to do are very fluid. I have a child right now in emerging adulthood, and her mind changes every day. Every day her mind changes as to what she wants to do with the world and in her life. So this new stage is coming into the theory here, right in between adolescence and young adulthood. Now, as we move to young adulthood, we don't say that intimacy waits for this. Relationships and whatnot began developing even pre-adolescent, learning how to care for others and whatnot. But it's at this point, maybe late 20s, early 30s, this is when the end of the biological clock might be kicking in. The psychological clock about planning might kick in and say, if I'm going to have kids, it's kind of a little bit of a crisis here. If I'm going to have kids, I better start having them now, because A, I want to be physically able to do it. B, I want to be alive when they go to college, 20 years from now. So making those, you're psychologically and biologically ready for this to happen. So the pressure might happen to develop these relationships, long-term relationships, and we're still in young adulthood. Career-wise, we are beginning our job developing expertise, which is really going to funnel into the next stage that we have, and that is middle adulthood, generativity. And that generation is the family, the larger social circle, work, vocation, creative endeavors, possibly even the development of the spirituality and these kinds. It's really kind of the work that's happening. And so we see this process of emerging adulthood gradually taking on what adulthood is, depending on, some people take it all on at once, some people just gradually. Then a young adulthood, you're really kind of building the walls and whatnot. In middle adulthood, you're decorating, you got all your furniture for this identity house that you have, and you're really kind of building this structure that will then, following middle adulthood, we go into maturity, ego integrity, and the notion of the legacy that we will live. What house did we build? So you look around this circle and we can see infancy and early childhood. We have trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, building the foundation for our identity. We have a focal point during adolescence, thinking about all the options. We move into emerging adulthood as we take on slowly, piece by piece, at different speeds, our acceptance into full adulthood. We enter into young adulthood, building the walls of our house made up of family, friends, and our work, and all those things. Through middle adulthood, we refine all those things in order to create the legacy that we then pronounce in late life. So this is the lifespan kind of laid out. It's just an elegant theory and applicable to almost, think about getting a new job. You can actually kind of look through those stages. You get into the job and it's like maybe a trust versus mistrust. What can I do on my own? Can I be initiatives, find out what I'm good at? Then I start developing a good work identity based, what are my relationships as I move, not necessarily romantic relationships, but what's my relationships in work as I kind of find my place within the organization, and then I'm developing my what I'm going to contribute to there, and then at the end, what did I do? You can almost look at almost any process and sort of develop that and use Erickson's theory to outline those. So let's take a look at the assessments for this week. We have Chapter 9, Discussion A, which I'm asking you to reflect upon your own experience with any and maybe all of those clocks. Just get right into it, talk about all those different clocks, your own biological clock, psychological clock, social clock, and history clock is really fun to talk about as well. And the second discussion is looking at the stage you're in and other people around you. Can make sure you consider other people around you in that discussion as well, because you want to compare what was my where's my parents now in comparison to me? Where's my kids? Where's my uncle? And where's my friends and whatnot? in relation to that. And then finally, a quiz asking you to evaluate your which generation you're in and what does that look like for you. Is it accurate, not accurate? Those are like the Gen X, millennials, those kind of things. So that's it for this week. Don't do the next chapter, just chapter 9, and I will see you in the discussion boards.